他回忆起前世是另一处的村民，今生只想逃离原生家庭，回到过去。美国 Discovery 纪录片联手心理学家到世界各地解开轮回之谜，震惊世界。
Could we ever come back?
I think there is some likelihood of life after death.
The answer may come from children, remembering a life before they were born.
Our work provides evidence that we should strongly consider the possibility of reincarnation.
美国一家庭父亲投胎转世为自己的孩子，身为虔诚教徒的他们对轮回大感震惊。
I wasn't brought up, with learning about reincarnation. I was brought up Southern Baptist, and certainly did not hear about reincarnation.
大家好，欢迎来到杰克奇谈，我是 Jack。今天就带你看看由美国 Discovery 拍摄的有关轮回转世的秘密。儿童心理学家吉米·塔克博士是继史蒂文森后着手研究轮回转世的科学家，至今研究了超过3000例轮回转世的案例。他也是维吉尼亚大学精神病学与神经行为科学教授，并于1996年加入伊恩·史蒂文森博士前世今生研究团队，并著有《儿童前世记忆的科学调查档案》、回到生活，记得前世记忆的儿童的非凡案例、之前儿童的前世记忆一书。在之前的节目里，我也介绍了史蒂文森研究的转世的案例，有兴趣的朋友可以翻看往期的节目。吉米塔克研究团队为了使研究更有信服力，他们也把许多案例拍成纪录片。今天要重点介绍的就是由美国 Discovery 跟踪拍摄的轮回转世的案例。冰岛大学教授海洛森在斯里兰卡做了大量的轮回转世研究，因为在斯里兰卡这个地方每年都会有好几例轮回投胎转世的案例，所以这个地方是他们重点研究的基地。这次的拍摄，海洛森教授带领 Discovery 团队去见一位对于他们来说比较罕见的案例。这名叫迪露西的女孩自小就告诉他们的父母，她还有其他家庭并在另外一个地方，而且她前世是溺水身亡的。记忆觉醒后，就对现任的父母产生排斥的现象，一直要现任父母带她回到前世家庭里。经过一番的路程，海洛森教授带领着拍摄团队及翻译到了小女孩的家里。对于迪露西的家庭而言，迪露西的记忆觉醒对他们家人造成了巨大的打击，因为迪露西对现在的原生家庭产生了距离感，这使到父母亲都很痛心，尤其是身为母亲更是伤心欲绝。
She first started speaking of her previous life when we took her to Montessori preschool. She also mentioned when we went to the temple that her temple was in a different place. And when we had our meals and went to bed at night, she would again mention her previous life.
In fact, I had become so irritated by what she was saying that I beat her once.
I felt very bad about all of this. Deluxi was constantly speaking about her previous family. It felt as if she was condemning me for being a bad mother, for not looking after her properly.
Could you tell us what it is that she still remembers?
There was a footbridge across the stream near my house. People from the village would walk across the bridge and bathe in the stream. There was a rock near my house where I used to play shop with my friends. I have always felt that I don't belong in my present family. Their furniture and belongings are different from the family I remember. I remembered very clearly the clothes and goods of my previous family. From my earliest memories, I felt like an outsider, and that I must do whatever I could to find my real family.
Which means these memories are real to Deluxi.
The day I died, I went to the stream to swim with a friend of mine. And then, somebody pushed me. I was in the water when I died.
所以常有人质疑说，轮回转世是否真的存在？因为没有记忆，记不起前世的点点滴滴。从这个案例就可以知道，你若记得前世或多次记忆，未必是一件好事。自然之法会把记忆删除掉，是有它的缘由的。如果每个人都拥有前世记忆，那你想想，若这个男人带着记忆再次重生，是件多么可怕的事情！接着，教授又提到斯里兰卡这个佛教徒占大多数国家里，不止佛教徒出现了轮回转世，而且基督教及回教徒一样出现了轮回转世的案例。
Here in Sri Lanka, we find most of the cases among Buddhist families. Of course, the majority of the population here is Buddhist, about two-thirds. But we also find some cases among Christians, and we even find a few among the Muslims. So the cases in Sri Lanka are found in all the major religious communities.
由于为了尽快找到迪露西前世所在的村子，海洛森教授想到了到报馆登报寻人的启事，而新闻从业人员也相当的配合，因为对于他们来说是一个相当有吸引力的题材。
Mr. Apipala, he learned about the case. He went and interviewed Diluxi and the parents about what she had been saying about the previous life. It was then published a few days later, and this newspaper has a distribution all over the country.
For the journalist, it was a good story.
I consider this case unique because for over 30 years I've researched these types of stories and have come across various people who talked about their previous births. But this one is 1 in 1,000.
His readers were enthralled with Diluxi's mysterious memories and the remarkable details she remembered. But for now, one question remains unanswered. Will the scientists find a match to Diluxi's memories of an earlier life and death? A newspaper journalist had written an article about Diluxi's memories of a past life. The article mentioned that the girl thinks she used to live near the Dambula rock temple. Several weeks after the article was published, the mail arrives at the Nisanka home. When the postman handed Mr. Nisanka his mail that day, he was surprised to find one letter postmarked from Dambula. He had no friends or relatives in that part of the country. When he opened the letter, he was stunned.
I was very surprised to receive a letter by a Mr. Ranatunga. He lives in Dambula. I was stunned when I read that his little daughter had died just the way Diluxi had always talked about. He talked about the river and the footbridge. His little girl was called Shiromi.
Shiromi's father confirmed many of Diluxi's statements, and he said he would like to meet her.
I missed my previous parents very much, and I longed to see them again. After this letter, my second mother was finally convinced, and she agreed we would go and meet with them.
There was nothing her current parents could do. Diluxi was now determined to meet the people who she believed were her true family. If they would not take her to them, she threatened to run away. The letter finally convinced Diluxi's parents. They were going to take her to the place where she thinks she died. took Delucci on a 6-hour drive to Dambulla. When they came closer to the city, Delucci began to recognize landmarks. She even started to direct the driver toward the house where her previous family lived. Even today, after several meetings, it is still a moving reunion. For Professor Haraldson, a rare opportunity to witness what could be two lives intersecting.
This meeting is quite emotional. It's only about in a third of all cases in Sri Lanka that you are able to find a connection between what that child is saying and a previous family or a person who died that fits the description. This is very rare.
Professor Haraldson is astounded by the change in character as soon as Delucci meets her previous family. She is less withdrawn and seems to fit in much more naturally with this family. Could she really be this little girl, reborn?
Shiromi was a very obedient girl who never left the house without informing us where she was going. She always left the house with her younger brother and her sister to swim or to play. And one day she just did not come back. I was so upset that Shiromi hadn't returned home that I ran about looking for her. When they found her in the water, I fainted upon hearing I'd lost my daughter. When Delucci was brought here, she was able to recognize us as her previous parents. She was also able to recognize her old belongings and the neighbors who lived nearby. All of this convinced me she was my child, reborn.
I know I am that little girl over there in that picture. When I saw my previous parents and previous brother and sister, I felt very happy. It felt like I was finally returning home after a very long time away.
At the end of the day, Delucci takes Professor Haraldson for a walk to show him the sights of her previous life.
When we compare how well these statements fit the life of Shiromi, we find that about 12 of them, and we have around 20, about 12 of them fit really well and are fairly specific.
Delucci leads Professor Haraldson to the rock, where she claimed she played as little Shiromi. It is a flat rock formation, just as she had described. The footbridge over the little river is also there. And this is the spot where Shiromi fell into the water.
When I come to this particular spot, I become very afraid. In general, I am not afraid of water. But when I come to this spot, I get very scared.
Delucci tells the scientist that she remembers black spots just before she died. Haraldson thinks the water plants growing in the river might account for this.
I think there is something real there. She has some real images of these events, but I think these images, these thoughts were with her from a very early age and even continue to some extent up to the present day.
Delucci herself is convinced that she died here, in her previous life. For many who evaluate the evidence that Haraldson and his colleagues have gathered, the answer is simple. If you believe in reincarnation, this research gives some scientific basis to this belief.
I think there is some likelihood of life after death, and I think that there might be something real in these memories. And that would then support the theory of reincarnation.
在轮回投胎转世的案例里，有些案例会让这些转世的案例可信度更大的增加，那就是胎记。这些胎记的形成很多都是当事人前世遭受伤害或者杀害受伤的部位所形成的。
And we've been able to track down autopsy reports or medical records to make sure that in fact there was a match there.
For the first time, these birthmarks provide a physically verifiable piece of evidence suggesting reincarnation.
We don't have a lot of American cases that have the birthmarks or birth defects along with the memories. We do have some, but it's unusual, so we certainly like to investigate all those that we can.
And Jim Tucker is about to visit one of these cases. He is boarding a flight to Florida to meet a boy who remembers being a New York policeman killed in a hail of gunfire.
When I was big, I was a police officer. I walked into a store one night. They were bad guys, too. They shot me dead.
Pensacola, the home of Maria Hagedorn. She is the mother of two children, 2-year-old Mia and 5-year-old Ian. Ian is a very sick boy.
What kind of dress do you like to wear?
Maria Hagedorn's son suffers from a very rare heart disease. If he exerts himself too much, he struggles for air and faints. Trips to the family cardiologist are frequent. Continued observation a must. Little Ian had 6 major heart operations before he turned 4.
He was a big, healthy 8.5-pound baby, and they took him off. They said to take a bath, give him a bath, and they never came back. Over an hour went by, so I sent my husband off to find the baby, and he came back quite a bit later with 2 doctors, and they were all crying, very visibly shaken, which I knew that the news was not good.
The doctors told Maria that Ian would not live through his first day. Only an emergency operation would save his life. 6 hours after his birth, Ian underwent major heart surgery.
Ian had underdevelopment of the pulmonary valve, which is the artery right here we see in this drawing, and that caused the right side of his heart not to develop as well. And what that leads to is a lack of oxygen in his blood. So it's a condition where he is essentially suffocating because not enough oxygen is delivered to the brain and to the rest of the body.
Ian's surgery went well. After almost 9 hours, a team of doctors managed to repair the valve. But the underdevelopment of the right side of his heart would take time and more operations. Ian's life is still at risk today. What brings Jim Tucker to this case is an event that took place over a year before Ian was born.
My dad was a police officer, and he walked into Radio Shack, and he could tell something was going on. 2 guys up at the front desk pulled a machine gun out of their overcoat and pointed it at the manager. And my dad pulled his revolver and said, "Drop your weapons, I'm a police officer." And somebody was shooting him quite immediately after he said that. 12 people get light.
Jim Tucker and Maria Hagedorn review her father's autopsy report. Eerily, the cause of death jumps out at anyone reading this report. Maria's father died from a ruptured pulmonary artery caused by a gunshot wound, the same artery that is causing Ian's misery. But something else happened that seemed even stranger to Ian's mother.
The first time was when he was about 3, and I was doing some work in my office, and he was making quite a bit of noise, and I had threatened him with a spanking if he didn't quiet down. And he stood there and looked at me and said, "When you were a little girl and I was your daddy, lots of times you were bad and I never spanked you," which just kind of blew me away. He didn't get a spanking.
And then Ian began to talk more about his grandfather.
Growing up, we had 2 cats, a black cat and a white cat, and the black cat was Maniac, and the white cat was Boston. So one day I was doing something, and Ian came over to me and he said, "Mom, when you were a little girl and I was your daddy, what was my cat's name?" And I said, "Maniac?" And he said, "No, the white one." And I said, "Boston?" And he said, "I used to call him Boss, right?" So he knew the color of the cats, and he knew the nickname that only my dad used to call Boston.
Maria collected more and more stories like this one from Ian. She is now convinced that Ian is her father reborn. It isn't only the stories, but the physical evidence, the correlation between Ian's heart disease and her father's mortal wound, that has removed all doubt from her mind.
Much of these cases often involves memories and statements and behaviors. The birthmarks are something that's completely objective, and it's something that is beyond memory or beyond chance.
Maybe Ian's memory is fooling him. Perhaps his random statements are connected to his grandfather by pure luck. But it's the combination of memory and physical evidence that is so convincing.
I didn't want to go back, but God just gave me to you.
God gave you to your mom? Even though you didn't want to come back?
The case of Ian Hagedorn demands the question, what does all this evidence mean?
There are obviously huge questions here which we haven't even begun to try to answer, such as, is there a soul? If so, what does that term even mean? How does it get carried over from one life to the next? When you look at all these cases, you can certainly focus on the weaknesses if you choose to. But I think there's also enough here so that if you choose, you can step back and say that there may just be something remarkable going on.
If Dr. Tucker is right, the memories of all these children could mean that death may just be a road to another life.
吉米·塔克博士也研究了一例相当有趣的案例。这案例发生在美国，而且现在记忆觉醒的小孩是现任的父亲的爸爸转世，也就是他的爷爷的转世，晋升投生了，成为了孙子。他爷爷是以1993年在家里中风去世，而现在的小孩则是爷爷过世后1年诞生。这位小孩子名叫加斯。随着日子的过去，小孩也透露出爷爷更多当时的资讯，而小孩对爷爷的了解程度甚至超越了身为爸爸的他，这不禁令他越来越感到困惑及震惊。小孩说，当他还是前世的爷爷时，他还记得死在医院里，然后看见神给了他一张卡片，并告诉他拿到卡片的人可以再一次投胎为人。
A hospital in America. An old man is dying. And a young boy believes he is this man reborn. Gus Ortega is a normal 6-year-old. Like most boys, he cherishes his time with his dad. But this relationship is different. Gus remembers that he played with his dad in a previous life. Only then, he was the father, and his dad was his son. This is the case that UVA scientist Jim Tucker is investigating.
Whenever I go to see a case, I go with a certain amount of skepticism. I never go with the assumption that this is reincarnation. And that's also the same approach that I have with the work as a whole. We're here because this is an interesting phenomenon, so we're trying to learn as much about it as possible.
Catch it! Oh, good job!
Grandpa Augie died in 1993. His son Ron found him lying on the floor in his home. A stroke. Grandpa Augie died 5 hours later. He was a shopkeeper. He sold everything people wanted to buy, and he loved his family. But he never met his grandson, Gus. Gus was born 1 year after Grandpa Augie's death. One day, when he was just a year and a half, Gus was alone in his room with his father.
Ron came out and told me that he had just finished changing Augie's diaper, and that he looked right up at him and said, "You know, Dad, when I was your age, I used to change your diaper."
I was flabbergasted, to be honest with you. I thought it was just kind of strange, especially the choice of words to say that phrase, "when I was your age," for this little 1.5-year-old toddler.
He started talking about Grandpa, and just the little things he was saying that we knew he couldn't have known because he never met Grandpa. His grandfather died a year before he was born. So, yeah, we were pretty puzzled about it.
Then one day, Ron Ortega brought a set of old photos home, and something even more remarkable occurred.
And I said, "Oh, look, look at this old photograph." And he came up to it and he goes, "Oh, there's me." I mean, I was like, just totally astounded, it just stopped me, cold. I mean, because how would he know that?
Gus would make more statements like that over the course of the next years. He would recollect episodes of his grandfather's life that even Ron could hardly remember. And he was there. Gus knew more about his grandfather than he should have. Is this evidence of reincarnation? How else can these children remember another life? The case files of Dr. Jim Tucker will yield more clues.
When I went to heaven, God gave me a card. Everybody with a card like that is allowed to come back. I want it to come back.
The Ortega home in Colorado. Jim Tucker from the University of Virginia cannot just reject what little Gus has to say about a previous life.
There are certainly a lot of people who will simply dismiss this work because it disagrees too much with their assumptions about how the world works. But to dismiss something because it disagrees with your assumptions is really not very scientific. So we have this phenomenon, and we have the evidence that it's involved with this phenomenon. So the scientific approach is to explore it and learn all we can about it.
The Ortega home in Colorado. Dr. Jim Tucker is interviewing Gus Ortega. Gus claims to have lived before as his grandfather.
And how about your grandmother?
Yeah.
And were you a little boy when you were doing that, or was that when you were big? That was when you were big?
Is Gus telling the truth? Tucker has no way of knowing. That is why the most crucial information in many cases come from the parents. Jim Tucker interviews Kathy and Ron Ortega. Standard procedure.
And when was the next time that he said something that suggested he had information, that he knew things about your dad?
Gus said, I had a sister, but she died. She's a fish now. And he said, well, some bad guys hurt her. Mm-hmm. And that really made me stop, because I only recently heard the whole facts of this story about my father's sister, and she indeed was murdered, and she was thrown into San Francisco Bay.
A family secret. Little Gus could never have heard about this story, because even Ron Ortega did not know about his father's sister. How could his son?
I really hadn't thought of reincarnation or even putting that word in connection with what was happening. I wasn't brought up, with learning about reincarnation. I was brought up Southern Baptist, and certainly did not hear about reincarnation.
If you had told me that a year ago, yeah, right. You've come back. Uh-huh. But, now, anything can happen. Yeah, anything.
In his hotel room, Jim Tucker reviews his notes. There are many questions, especially when it comes to same family cases, like the Ortegas.
Whenever we investigate a case, we certainly have to assess the reliability of the informants. With this same family case, we always have the concern that the family members are grieving for the lost family member, and therefore have the wish that the child would be returned.
Despite the possible weaknesses with cases like the Ortegas, there are still many questions that nobody seems to have convincing answers to.
Whether you accept the idea that this necessarily means reincarnation, which means a soul that moves from one body to the next, that's for each person to decide.
伊恩·史蒂文森曾经对吉米·塔克说道，他会以失败者的身份离世，因为他没有实现他的主要目标，即让整个主流科学认真考虑转世的可能性。这个目标可能是不切实际的，但伊恩对自己的选择的道路没有任何遗憾。相反，他享受这个旅程，幸运和足够有智慧，能够将他生命中的许多年都投入到他感兴趣的事物的研究中。虽然他可能没有说服整个主流科学界，但他确实打开了很多人的眼界，包括许多科学家。就如佛陀所说，众生的轮回转世是无量的，起始与终点是不可被预知的，但跳出三界的涅槃之道已被佛陀清楚地悟到了。若有机会让你再次选择，你会再度回来人间吗？或者投往天道，亦或去向涅槃呢？选择权在你的手中，你会开始行动了吗？好的，关注杰克奇谈，带你突破思维的疆界，我们下期再见。